When President Washington voluntarily chose not to seek a third term in office, it set an important precedent. It wasn't until Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1940s that the president would serve a third term. It was a possibility until after that time when the Constitution was amended. But in the election of 1796, two candidates, the Federalist John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican or Jeffersonian Republican, had a heated battle. And the way the Constitution was at the time, the person who got the most electoral votes would be president, and the runner-up would serve as vice president. This is what happened with Adams and Jefferson, and as you might imagine, it led to quite a bit of conflict within the Adams administration. The first major test of the Adams administration was the XYZ affair. When the United States signed Jay's Treaty with England and refused to support the French Revolution, the French began attacking American ships. And when we sent ambassadors to speak with French officials about the matter, the three French officials, nicknamed X, Y, and Z, demanded that the United States pay a bribe before they would even discuss the matter with us. Americans were outraged, and this sparked a quasi-war, or an undeclared naval war, between the United States and France. During this time, Adams' popularity skyrocketed as he prepared for the possibility of an official war with France. As it turned out, the matter was resolved before it came to that point. But in the meantime, the Federalist administration pushed through the Alien and Sedition Acts. These were designed to, for one thing, make it more difficult for immigrants, especially from France, to enter the United States. This was made possible because of the climate of the quasi-war with France, but there were also political motivations behind it. These immigrants tended to vote as Democrats upon becoming American citizens, and the Sedition Acts made it a crime to criticize the government. This was used against Republican newspaper editors and created a strong backlash against the Federalist Party. One example of this backlash is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote these documents for the states of Virginia and Kentucky, claiming that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and declaring them null and void in those states. This argument of nullification claimed that a state had the right to nullify a federal law. The debate over whether or not nullification was an option would continue for decades. You should also be aware of an important Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison. John Adams' last act as president was to appoint what were called midnight judges. In the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson, representing the opposite party, was elected, Adams knew that the Federalist Party was in trouble. For one thing, they had lost the presidency, they had lost seats in Congress, and their one stronghold left was the judicial branch. So just as he was going out of office, he appointed a number of Federalist judges to the courts. In Jefferson's administration, his Secretary of State, Madison, refused to grant one of these appointed judges, Marbury, his commission. When this went to the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, reached a surprising judgment in the case. Congress had passed a law requiring elected officials to carry out such a duty, and you would expect the Federalist-packed Supreme Court to rule in favor of a Federalist, but that wasn't the case. The court actually declared the law unconstitutional. At first, it may have seemed as a sign of weakness, giving in to the Republicans, but this actually set an important precedent for the power of the Supreme Court. This was the first time they exercised the power to declare a law unconstitutional. When Thomas Jefferson became president after the election of 1800, in many ways it was seen as a revolution of sorts, the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson and others of his party had a very different view of government from that of the Federalists. They believed in lowering taxes and decreasing the power of the military. And as I've already mentioned, Jefferson had more of an agrarian vision for the American economy. He was usually a strict constructionist, as we've seen with the National Bank. But there were occasional exceptions to this principle. When it came to the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson found himself compromising with his strict constructionism. When he saw the opportunity to purchase a vast piece of land from France in 1803 between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains for a very low price, he knew that the Constitution didn't grant the president the authority to make such a purchase. But not wanting to risk the possibility of letting a good deal get away, he went ahead and made that purchase, vastly expanding the territory of the United States. Jefferson has a reputation for being a great civil libertarian, and in many ways he earned that reputation. It's well deserved. For example, when it came to religious freedom, Jefferson was instrumental in making sure that at the end of the American Revolution, the state of Virginia, his home state, provided for religious liberty. But in some ways, he was inconsistent when it came to civil liberties. Particularly if you look at Native Americans and African American slaves. Jefferson, although in his eyes, the Native Americans had potential to be assimilated and live alongside the white man, he clearly saw them as inferior. When it came to African Americans, Jefferson was clearly a racist. You can see this by looking at his notes on the state of Virginia. In addition to his racist opinions, Jefferson also knew that he had a financial stake in his own slaves. He also feared that if slaves were set free and left in America, that there would be resulting violence, a backlash against being enslaved. However, Jefferson did express being uncomfortable with slavery. He recognized that it was wrong, and he once compared slavery to having the wolf by the ears. What did he mean by that, when you have a wolf by the ears? On the one hand, it's an uncomfortable position. You wish you hadn't gotten yourself into it, but on the other hand, you're afraid to let go, aren't you? Jefferson had uncomfortable feelings about participating in slavery, but at the same time, he couldn't imagine giving it up. He believed that if slaves were set free, they would need to be sent back to Africa, recolonized. He viewed slavery as a necessary evil. By that, I mean that he recognized it as wrong, but he defended it as being necessary. I want to stress this point because later on in the course we'll see how that the South leaned towards a different defense of slavery over time. They got away from seeing it as a necessary evil and began defending it as a positive good, something that they were no longer willing to make excuses for, but defend without shame. When it came to foreign policy, Jefferson had to deal with the matter of the United States being caught in the middle of the conflict between France and England, as I mentioned in the previous lecture. Both were attacking our ships, and England in particular was practicing impressment against our sailors. They would board our ships and claim that there were deserters from the British Royal Navy on board those ships, and they were there to reclaim them. That may have been true in some cases, but it is also true that sometimes the accusations were false, and they basically kidnapped American sailors. In an attempt to stay out of war, Jefferson tried economic warfare with an embargo. What is an embargo? It's a ban on foreign trade. The idea behind the embargo was that if we cut off trade with European nations, they would feel the pinch and show a willingness to work things out with the United States. As it turned out, though, we felt the pinch much more than they did, especially in New England, where commercial centers depended on trade for a living. The embargo was unsuccessful in negotiating with France and England, and it hurt the American economy. As a result, we ended up experimenting with different versions of an embargo. With the passage of Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810, we declared that we would trade exclusively with the nation, France or England, that would first agree to respect our rights. As it turned out, France was the first to take us up on this offer, and we reinstated embargo with England. During President Madison's administration, a number of congressmen known as war hawks were demanding that we stop putting off the inevitable and declare war on England. Henry Clay of Kentucky was one of these war hawks. Another was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. They believed the time had come to declare war. For one thing, it was a matter of honor. They were disgusted with England's practice of attacking our ships and impressing our sailors, but they also saw war as an opportunity to expand territory, for the United States to acquire parts of Canada and Florida. At the same time, we were also dealing with threats from Native Americans, such as Tecumseh and his attempt at building a confederacy of Native American tribes. England was cooperating with Native Americans, and so it seemed that we were being squeezed from both sides. When we did declare war on England in 1812, for a while it went very badly for us. And then in 1814, when Napoleon surrendered in Europe, England was able to focus all of its attention on America. At one point, they invaded the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. They invaded so suddenly, by surprise, they were burning down government buildings, and President Madison and his wife Dolly had to leave the White House in such a hurry that they left their dinner behind on the table for the British troops to eat. Soon after this, at the Battle of Baltimore, things went better for the Americans. This is where the Star-Spangled Banner was written, and if you're familiar with the song, as you should be, you know that at the end of the battle, the American flag was still flying, and it seemed that maybe there would be hope for survival. But probably the most famous battle of the War of 1812 was the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, the famous Indian fighter, gained even more fame by leading Americans to an astounding victory over the British in New Orleans. Interestingly, the treaty ending the war had already been signed before the Battle of New Orleans took place, but with communication being so slow at the time, Jackson didn't realize that the war was supposed to be over. Of course, with the nature of the timing, the victory at New Orleans didn't have an impact on the outcome of the treaty. It was basically a status quo antebellum treaty. Not much changed from the way it had been before the war. The major significance of this war was that we survived intact, and we came out of the war with more confidence and pride than ever. For a while in the early republic, many were basically holding their breaths, wondering how long America would survive. Another story of slow communication is the Hartford Convention. While the Treaty of Ghent was being negotiated, Federalists in New England met together to protest the war. Remember that the embargo before the War of 1812 and the war as well did much to hurt trade in New England, and it was devastating to the economy. So many of the Federalists met protesting the war and demanding that Congress make major changes to protect their region from such a tragedy in the future. Some of the more radical Federalists actually went so far to talk about seceding from the Union. That seems ironic. We usually associate secession with the South, but there was actually some talk of it in New England. But as I said, they were in the minority, and the official action of the convention was making these demands on Congress. Remember what I said about slow communication. This was going on around the same time that the treaty ending the war was being negotiated, around the time that the Battle of New Orleans was fought, and Americans were hearing the news from all three of these events around the same time. Talk about bad timing. Had this not been the end of the war, had the war not gone out with such a bang at the Battle of New Orleans, maybe the Federalists would have gotten a different kind of attention. Maybe people would have listened to them. But as it turned out, Americans hear about these complaints and demands that they're making in a time of amazing patriotism. People hear the war is over and General Jackson won an amazing victory at New Orleans. There's something to celebrate. Oh, and by the way, the disgruntled Federalists are complaining. This was really bad timing for the Federalist Party, which was already in decline. From this point on, the Federalist Party was, for all practical purposes, dead. As I said before, the overall significance of the War of 1812 has a lot to do with pride and confidence. However, America would still face many problems, especially sectionalism that threatened to divide the nation even in the 1820s. I want to point out three examples of sectional conflict from this time. First of all, the Missouri Compromise. When Missouri Territory petitioned for statehood as a slave state to enter the Union in 1819, this threatened to tip the balance of power between slave states and free states in Congress. Henry Clay of Kentucky was able to resolve the situation with the Missouri Compromise, which called for receiving Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to maintain that balance. It also declared that in the future we would follow the 3630 parallel of latitude in determining whether territories could have slavery or not. Although this crisis was resolved for the time being, it sent a signal that foreshadowed growing sectionalism that would follow. You should also be aware of the disputed presidential election of 1824, where Andrew Jackson claimed that John Quincy Adams had only won the election through a corrupt bargain. This divided the nation as well, because Adams drew most of his support from the Northeast, and Jackson tended to draw supporters from the South and the West. We'll see more about their different views of government later on. And finally, consider the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. Tariffs, or taxes on imports, were designed to protect manufacturing within the United States from foreign competition. They were seen as a good thing in regions like New England that wanted to be able to compete. But in the South, tariffs were seen as a bad thing for the economy. And in 1828, when a high tariff was passed, Southerners declared it abominable. especially in South Carolina, where John C. Calhoun wrote his exposition and protest, claiming that such a tariff was unconstitutional and that a state like South Carolina had the right to nullify such a tariff. South Carolina didn't take that official action of nullification at that time, but it sparked a debate that would continue to divide the nation. Stay tuned, we'll talk more about tariffs and nullification later on.